George Plantagenet is remembered for one of the most unusual deaths in English history, the story that he was drowned in a barrel of wine. George Plantagenet was born into privilege, danger, and expectation. As the third surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, his life was shaped before it truly began. England was tearing itself apart in civil war, and the crown itself was unstable, blood-stained, and constantly contested. George grew up knowing that power was not inherited quietly. It was seized, defended, and lost, often within a single lifetime. When his elder brother became Edward IV, George did not simply become a younger son at court. He became a prince of the blood, granted the dukedom of Clarence, and positioned dangerously close to the throne. From the outside, his future looked secure. From the inside, it was a place of constant comparison, always measured against a brother who ruled and another brother, Richard, who waited. George was intelligent, proud, and deeply conscious of his status. But he was also restless. The Yorkist court was a place of favour and sudden reversals, and George learned early that affection from a king could never be taken for granted. Loyalty was rewarded until it wasn't. That lesson came swiftly. In the late 1460s, George allied himself with the most powerful nobleman in England, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Warwick was not merely a magnet, he was a force who helped place Edward IV on the throne. When Edward married Elizabeth Woodville without consulting him, Warwick felt sidelined, and George followed him. This was not merely rebellion, it was ambition sharpened by proximity. George married Warwick's daughter, Isabella Neville, binding himself to a man who believed kings could be made and unmade. Together, they turned against Edward IV. For a brief moment, it seemed as though George might step into the space his brother had vacated. But power is rarely so accommodating. The rebellion collapsed. Edward regained his throne, and George, astonishingly, was forgiven. He was restored to favour, welcomed back into court, and treated once again as a trusted brother. It should have been a warning. Instead, it became a precedent. George never truly accepted the limits of his position. Tragedy deepened the cracks. Isabella Neville died young, and George's grief hardened into bitterness. He became increasingly suspicious, convinced that enemies surrounded him, that his brother's court was hostile, that his own status was under threat. Chroniclers describe erratic behaviour, accusations without proof, and a growing sense that George saw betrayal everywhere he looked. Edward IV, pragmatic and increasingly weary, tried to contain his brother rather than confront him. But George made this impossible. He openly questioned royal authority, spread rumours, and even suggested that Edward himself might be illegitimate, a claim that struck at the very foundation of Yorkist rule. This was no longer private resentment. It was treason. In 1478, George was arrested and brought before Parliament. The charges were severe, and the evidence, while shaped by politics, was sufficient by the standards of the time. Edward IV did not rush to condemn him. Contemporary sources suggest hesitation, even reluctance. This was not a rival nobleman, this was his brother. But kingship demanded resolution. George, Duke of Clarence, was condemned to death. What followed has echoed through history, not because of certainty, but because of the story. According to later tradition, George was executed privately within the Tower of London and drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. The image is vivid, grotesque, and unforgettable. A nobleman submerged in sweetness, punished through excess. It appears in Tudor-era accounts and was repeated thereafter, becoming inseparable from his name. What cannot be verified is whether this is true. No contemporary official record confirms the method of execution. It is suggested that George was executed quietly, away from public spectacle, and buried without honour in Tewkesbury Abbey. The wine barrel story belongs to memory rather than documentation, yet it endured because it felt right to later generations. A man undone by indulgence, ambition, and appetite, consumed by the very world he could not navigate. George's death solved nothing cleanly. It left scars within the Yorkist family and removed a volatile presence from Edward IV's reign. It also cast a long shadow over his children, whose futures were shaped by their father's fall. In the end, George, Duke of Clarence, stands as one of the most tragic figures of the Wars of the Roses, not because he lacked opportunity, but because he never accepted its limits. Too royal to be ignored, too unstable to be trusted, and too close to the crown to survive his own ambition. History remembers him not as a king, but as a warning.